I should clarify, in case you're wondering, that I'm talking about the pleasures of receiving hate mail. This isn't a workshop on how to send hate mail. I think there's another workshop that the Australian Tea Party is organising at the other end of the city at the moment. As some of you would know, I hope as many of you would know, I write a newspaper column every Saturday in the Weekend Australian newspaper, and in the spirit of encouraging reader interaction, I leave at the bottom of every column an email address at which I can be contacted. Hate mail, then, is something of an occupational hazard for me. And since beginning my life as a Saturday columnist in September 2009, I think I've amassed something of a respectable pile of hate correspondence. I say respectable rather than impressive because sometimes I feel a little disappointed that I haven't received more hate mail. Often I'll sit down and check my inbox, and if I don't receive a few letters that suggest I'm either a cretin, a moron, a Zionist big Australia stooge of Rupert Murdoch's, or part of a vanguard of Asian invaders intent on destroying white Australia, then I feel like I haven't quite done my part. And they're all things, by the way, that have been caught via readers. Now, some of you are probably, no doubt, thinking that I'm something of a masochist for celebrating my receipt of hate mail. Perhaps that's true, but I think there's some truth in the idea that all writers are in some way masochistic. I think there's a wonderfully romantic, artistic ideal of suffering for your art or for your craft. But there's another reason, I think, why writers, or newspaper columnists anyway, don't mind getting nasty hate mail. Namely, if you're at the receiving end of abuse, it probably means that you're dealing with matters where something is at stake. And in any case, being in the business of public debate means that you need a pretty thick skin. And I suspect most columnists are like me in figuring that, given that's the case, you might as well take some pleasure from the argy-bargy or rough and tumble. Now, I came to this realisation pretty early, I think, in my foray into journalism. I should note here that I'm not, strictly speaking, a journalist. I'm not a full-time journalist. I wasn't trained as a journalist. But when I was completing my doctoral studies in England a few years ago, I went through the usual soul-searching, self-loathing, if you will, that a PhD tends to inspire. And in my case, this led me to try my hand at newspaper journalism. Now, one of the first outlets of my writing was the Guardian newspaper's Comment is Free website. Don't know if you read The Guardian, but readers of The Guardian will know that this is no place for the faint-hearted or for those with glass jaws. Commenters on the website, with the benefit of anonymity, of course, can offer pretty robust feedback. Quite often they're ruthless, if not downright nasty. I probably didn't appreciate this entirely when I set forth in March 2008 and began writing for Comment is Free. And my first article was something of an assessment, admittedly optimistic, of Gordon Brown and New Labour. But the reception I got from The Guardian's readers was rather more vicious than I had expected. In fact, when I went back to The Guardian's online archives last week to check it all out again, I think I winced a little as I read some of the comments. I mean, it was harsh, pretty brutal. And had I been lacking in a healthy dose of ego, or had I been less of a fig jam personality, to use that vernacular, I think it might have put to an end my ambitions to become a newspaper columnist. Let me show you what I mean. "Oh dear," wrote a commenter by the name of CJ. Quote, "This rubbish will be flamed good and proper, and rightly so." And CJ was pretty spot on about the flaming, because as you scroll down the page, you got comments, well, I got comments like, "What a lot of guff," or "Crap like this is really turning me off this paper," or "Pure tripe." One wrote, "While I'm a bit reluctant to criticise and judge someone on their first piece," kind of the defence of "some of my best friends are X or Y," this one from Tim Soutphommasane is poor. That's spelled out in capital letters. And as others have said, it is a type of article with its inability to really criticise Gordon Brown that is giving The Guardian a bad name. I love the fact that on the basis of your first article, you're already giving the newspaper a bad name. But there was one commenter who seemed to express some more balance, at least on first reading. But then he slipped the dagger in me just as I was least expecting it. Here's what he said. Wow, that's a lot of negativity and anger on this thread. Does no one have anything nice to say about this piece? I mean, I know I don't. It reads like a shoe shop attendant thinking aloud to himself. I'm not sure what my cobbler would think of that remark, but I don't think that was meant to be a compliment at all. It was a baptism of fire. But I took solace in a number of things. It was clear to me that a lot of the commenters were really just venting their anger. In my case, their anger about New Labour and Gordon Brown. And given at the time that New Labour was starting to get well and truly on the nose, I really had it coming. I mean, the equivalent of what I was writing would be praising New South Wales Labor last week, or complimenting the policy leadership of Mark Arbib and Karl Batar. I mean, that's the kind of proportion we're talking about. But as a general rule, if you have genuine conviction and belief in your judgment, you can't get yourself down on reader feedback. And in my case, I kept on writing for The Guardian's comment page. The nasty comments kept on coming. But then a few months later, I found myself working shifts writing leaders for The Guardian. And for those unfamiliar with newspaper speak, that means writing the newspaper's unsigned editorials. So I was grateful, at the very least, that The Guardian's editors didn't look at the comments on their own comment website. But my brief time at The Guardian taught me one thing, and that is that good newspaper columns should expect to attract criticism, if not abuse. And I had this illustrated to me in very dramatic terms one day when I was in The Guardian's office, and I was sitting opposite one of the political columnists, Jonathan Friedland, who I think is a great columnist at the newspaper. But I watched him exclaim, "Oh my God," at his desk, and sure enough, the whole editorial staff came behind his computer screen, because what was happening was his inbox was being flooded by thousands of emails because he had written something that had upset some Republican bloggers in the US. But at that moment, as I was standing there watching all this unfolding, I think I thought to myself, wow, you know, you've really made it as a columnist when you start getting a barrage of hate like that. As you can probably tell, I like to share my hate mail with my friends. So much so that one of my colleagues once asked me, "Do you get any fan mail at all?" Well, as it happens, in my defence, I do, and the history of my reader feedback and correspondence isn't all negative. If anything, it's a story of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But when it comes to generous reader appreciation, I think I reached my peak in late 2008. At the time, I was writing for the Financial Times, so I'd left The Guardian, once again in London. Maybe it was because I had no financial literacy, but I found myself very quickly assigned the regular role of writing what the writers there called the Saturday Shorty for the paper. It was a brief, little whimsical, light-hearted leader on Saturdays. I wrote an editorial about the need to impose a tax on the overweight and the obese, a fat tax. And that prompted a gem of a letter from a reader who quoted a letter from the Scottish philosopher David Hume in 1751. I won't read it to you, but it's fantastic. Lots of capital letters, as you know, the letters back then would have been written in. Another shorty about Australians and our love of work. The editor had the sick idea of giving the sole Australian on the leader writing staff the task of writing an Aussie-baiting editorial. I mean, I almost choked on my vomit. It proved a rather big hit on the FT News floor room, although I haven't told anyone until now that it was me who wrote it. And then there were the letters about my editorial on the Italian government's bailout of Parmigiano cheese. Yes, you may not know this happened, but in 2008 the Italian government bailed out Parmigiano makers in Italy to the tune of 50 million euros. But I was struggling. I didn't know what to write, and desperately seeking something half amusing, I resorted to that lowest form of humour, the pun. I mean, this leader had every cheesy pun, as it were, you could think of. So there were references to Mr. Luca Zaia, the Italian agriculture minister as the big cheese in Rome. Yes, you saw that one coming, didn't you? There were references to the bailout grating producers of other cheese varieties, to how the blood of some economic observers had curdled at the thought of, just let me finish, at the thought of more industry bailouts, to how mozzarella makers feared that without dipping into a fondue of government cash, they too would fall by the wayside. Thank you. There's more. Wait, there's more. And I finish by saying, unlike the cheese itself, the case for protecting Parmigiano has not been easy for some to digest. Now, I can tell you that this is the only article I've ever written that prompted a newspaper to publish in their letters page fan mail praising me for my wit and alleged brilliance. And if you'll forgive me a moment for being wildly immodest, this is a soapbox talk after all. A reader from New Jersey in the States wrote that the piece, quote, is an extraordinary tour de force. It covers the bailout topic con brio with a wittiness that is rarely found in the mainstream press. Even the New York Times waded in and made a note of the piece in an article documenting the cheese situation in Italy. And according to that venerable newspaper, quote, the coverage of the cheese bailout in the English language press has inspired a sort of arms race of punning. But no one, the newspaper said, took things quite so far as the author of a Financial Times editorial who left no pun unturned. It all verged on being a little embarrassing. I mean, seriously, the ratio of puns to paragraphs in that piece was so bad, I think I found it hard to look at my colleague's face when I turned up to the FT the next week. I still suspect, by the way, that the cheesiness of that piece had some bearing on the newspaper's decision not to keep me on as a full-time leader writer. Whatever the case, not long after my hopes of becoming a financial journalist were dashed, I returned to Australia. Which brings me, of course, to my experience of reader correspondence here. Now, I receive a good number of letters from readers of my column. Some weeks there can be a dozen or so letters, but some weeks there can only just be one or two. It really depends on the topic or the mood of the reader, I suppose. Now, some are one-line emails expressing a reader's total agreement with what you've written, and they're always nice to receive, I'll be honest. But some are 10 or 12 paragraph long letters. I still get sent letters in hard copy too that are handwritten or typed up in capital letters or in erratic font, outlining why the reader has disagreed with absolutely everything I've written, from the premise to the evidence to the conclusion. I think the only respite I have is that I don't have big teeth like Emma Jane, who shares the page with me on the newspaper. She apparently gets a lot of mail complaining about her big teeth. But anyway, many columnists stick to the general rule that they shouldn't respond to letters. The British columnist Michael Young, who for many years wrote for The Guardian, once wrote that a column should speak for itself. It's good advice. I, however, like to answer some of my mail. Now, there are, of course, some that are better left unanswered, so I tend not to respond, and I'm gulping here because I don't know if there are any around in this room, but I tend not to respond to climate change deniers who always write in when I cite evidence on climate change. And I tend not to respond either to readers who write in complaining that the RSPCA's targeting of certain aggressive dog breeds constitute a form of genocide. Their word, not mine. I tend not to respond to that. But there are other kinds of letters that I think merit a response. So when a reader has taken the time to write a considered critique or response to a column and have clearly written in good faith, I think courtesy and good manners demand that I write back. So I do. And the majority of my letters that I've received from readers of The Week in Australia, I think, fall into this category. But then there's another category. Now, I receive mail that you might describe as somewhat more robust in nature. Now, mail, it's usually written by intelligent readers, but they're the ones who find my political views or style fundamentally objectionable. Some are old-school Trotskyites, such as one reader who accused me of limiting discourse and limiting disagreement with the logic of the state. Quote, You do much to close down the public conversation by dramatically narrowing what can be said and understood. A sort of newspeak type operation. Quote. And this particular reader went on to assure me that this was more than simple ideological mésentente. Yet some readers of a more conservative persuasion charged me with a rather different crime. So I had one letter from a reader called Jeffery that suggested I needed to retrain in philosophy. I had to retake Philosophy 101. Quote, you would be well advised to retrain so that the awful non sequiturs, scrambled thoughts, and random quotes don't continue to expose you as a cerebrally incontinent crypto-Marxist poseur. I love that one. And I've come to regard cerebrally incontinent crypto-Marxist poseur as a badge of honour. Thanks, Jeffrey. But then there's a category of correspondence that I think truly merits the description of hate mail. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, geez, he's complaining, this isn't hate mail, this is just all fun and games. But in my case, every now and then I get correspondence I can only classify as bigoted or racist in character. And it usually happens whenever I write about national identity or multiculturalism or culture or race. Now, when I tell some of my friends and colleagues about the nature of the mail I receive, they usually think I exaggerate. So here's a sample of the kind of hate mail of this sort that I've received. The following is from someone called David in response to a piece I wrote about Australia Day, and apologies in advance for the language, but it's best that I read it out as it was. Quote, it's very simple, mate. Love it or leave it. Go get a job that does something for this country, join the army and go fight the Taliban. Otherwise, you have no place to comment or any right to voice your pathetic, unwanted, worthless opinion. I love my country, and I've put my life on the line defending it in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I shit on people like you. The message is simple. Don't like it, fuck off. That's from David. I can picture David sitting there at his computer after he typed this, kissing his flag and his Southern Cross tat in his biceps. Here's another one from a reader called Mark. I'd just written a column on biomedical technology, and I'd suggested that using biomedical technology for moral enhancement, so not physically enhancing yourself but changing parts of your behaviour, could be understood as an act of self-improvement. Here's what Mark wrote. Yes, so let's start with Asians, yourself included, given that they are the most racist of all peoples on the planet. You know it's true. What is it with Asians and race? Yes, what is it with us and race? Here's another from Jeffery, and I seem to get a lot of mail, by the way, from men called Jeffery. In response to a piece I wrote about cricket and the selection of Usman Khawaja for the Sydney Test match earlier this summer. And I'd made a passing comment about how I used to play cricket growing up in southwestern Sydney, which, as many of you know, is like an ethnic melting pot of Sydney. I mean, something like 40 or 50% of people in the area don't speak English at home. But I found that whenever I played cricket, I was more or less the only Asian boy on the cricket field. So I made a remark that the cricket field in those parts of Sydney was still a sanctuary for Anglo-Australians. Not a normative judgment, just an observation of fact as I experienced it. But here's what Jeffrey wrote in response. Quote, more Asian anti-white racism, more Asian arrogance from a bona fide Asian racist. So Asians taking over the education system is equality, is it, Tim? This is why the White Australia policy was put in place, Tim, to stop Asians taking over, and Aussies who want to protect Anglo culture is jingoistic and nasty. And I haven't changed from the letter, that's what he wrote, even though it's grammatically incorrect. Asians good, whites bad. Good one, Tim. I'm glad we've got that one sorted. Where are you from, Tim? Laos, was it? Laugh out loud. Go home soon, Tim. If you feel an Anglo-Saxon country with an Anglo-Saxon legal system and government doesn't suit, I've got news for you. You came here from a failed Asian country and a failed inferior culture. Feel free to leave. The sooner, the better. Just when you thought that there was no one left interested in defending white Australia. And for the record, I was born in France, and I like white Anglo-Saxon Australians. My girlfriend is a white Anglo Saxon Australian. Hell, I even used the name Tim rather than my actual Lao name. Now, I could go on, but there's a lot more, and there's a lot more where this came from, but I think you should get the general idea. In most cases of racist hate mail, I don't respond. When there's so much anger and hate, you know you're dealing with people who aren't really out to have a reasoned exchange, but are either blowing off steam or seeking to intimidate you, or perhaps both. But there was one occasion when I did respond, and it was in response to the following from someone called Fred, not Jeffery. But the letter arrived after an Australia Day piece in 2010 and began, quote, Tim, Tim, Tim. 1. You were not born here. And that's a U with a U, not Y-O-U. You have no ancestral background here. 2. You're Asian. 3. You're a left-wing academic. 4. Did your relatives fight on foreign battlefields to keep this country free? Wow, he's got me pinned. And it continued, you, of course, are only interested in the pillaring of white Anglo-Saxons, which makes you nothing but a racist, spelled R-A-S-C-I-S-T. Now, I actually responded to this reader, and I essentially told him to get stuffed. And I thought I gave as good as what I got. But what I didn't expect was for the reader's wife to respond. Here's the response. Dear Tim, hi, how are you? I definitely agree with you in every way. And by the way, this is Cynthia talking to you now. The other person before is my husband Jeff, who calls himself Fred. Sorry for Jeff's rudeness and bad language skills. I'm Iranian myself, so I can clearly see your point of view. But what can we do? Each one is entitled to their own opinion. Keep up the good work, as it seems racism and minority group hating seems to be on the rise. God bless you. What can you say to that? Some concluding thoughts. The business of public debate, as I've said, is no place for pussycats. You have to love the debate, you have to love the disagreement, you have to love the conflict. And I do. Now, once upon a time when people actually gave speeches on a soapbox in a street or a park corner, when are we going to do that, by the way, Claire? When are we going to take this out into the parks? Once upon a time, soapbox talkers had to contend with hecklers. In fact, I was on John Fane earlier this week, and I was inviting hecklers to turn up, so I'm a little disappointed no one did. But it was part of the fun, part of the carnival of rhetoric. And I suppose I see rigorous exchanges with readers in very much the same vein, in general. But there are some cases of correspondence that give me reason to pause, and I think expressions of bigotry and racism, I don't like invoking the word racism, but if it does exist, then it does exist, always have that effect. Can we have a world without hate mail? No, of course we can't. And in any case, I think my world would be a little poorer without the occasional bile, vitriol, and personal attacks. And the truth of the matter is, I get something of an unlikely pleasure from receiving my racist hate mail. We all, every one of us, have small, sometimes grotesque pleasures in life. And for me, there's a certain pleasure in knowing that there's nothing that might infuriate my typical angry hate correspondent more than seeing a yellow man with slanty eyes with an unpronounceable ethnic last name but anglicised first name gazing at him from the pages of the Weekend Australian. Thank you.